Hello. In today's operating system lecture, we are going to be looking at security. In the context of this course, security is not the core component of the course. We are only looking at security from the point of view of how it impacts operating systems and basic computing functionalities. We will be covering more advanced topics in security in later courses such as principles of security. But in this lecture, we'll be focusing on some of the basics that are relevant to operating systems and basic security. So when we take a computing environment, when we take an operating system environment, we can identify a number of key goals that we need to ensure for them to be identified as secure environments. So the three main goals that we would have in terms of security is confidentiality, integrity, and availability. So confidentiality is all about if there's a particular piece of information, a data that is stored somewhere, the owner of the data should have control over who gets access to that data and who is not able to access that data. So the data is only released to people that we explicitly say that they can access that data. So that is confidentiality. Integrity is about we need to know who is able to modify that data and there are no unauthorized modifications on the data. So we know the data that is available to us is there's no impact on the integrity of the data. There's no unauthorized modification of the data. There's no tampering with the data that has happened. So that is integrity. Then availability, regardless of whether we have this data, the confidentiality is ensured, the integrity is ensured, but if we are not able to access that data, if that data is not available to us when we need it, then that is also a security implication. So that is the third point that we would have as a security goal. That is, if there is a data that is available, it should be available when we need it. Nobody should be able to deny that access to us. So these are in the form of denial of service attacks and so on. These should not happen to the data. So these are the three main goals that we would have in any security environment. So when we take a secure environment, when we take a secure computing environment, operating system environment, we can identify these security threats coming from a number of entities. We can identify these intruders under a number of common categories. So the first one is casual non-technical users. So these are people who stumble upon the data without any particular effort. Say for example, if you have left your computer logged on in an office environment, and if somebody is passing by and they can see that information, if they can see that system, if they can see that data, they have not put a lot of effort, they haven't put any technical effort into accessing that data, but they are able to access. So that is one type of a user. So these are casual users. They are just interested in this data and they are just trying to see what they can see. So for example, employees may have access to certain systems and they are just checking on some data without any particular intention of causing any harm, but they are accessing without authorization, for example. The second case is insiders. So these are again insiders of an organization. They are snooping into these systems. They are going into these systems and checking what they can glean from that system. So if there is some data that is stored in the systems, for example, in the case of a university, maybe for students may try to get into systems and see if they can get some information that are stored by academics, that are stored by staff members. Or the same with in an organizational environment, you may want to see what your manager has put in a review system. So things like that can be categorized as snooping by insiders. So these are users inside to that organization who have some level of access to those systems, but they are using that access for an unnecessary purpose. Then the third category is people who are determined to make money using this access. Say, for example, maybe you are an insider, maybe you are not an insider, but you are trying to access this system. Your focus is about getting some information and then as a result using that to make money. Either you are selling that information or using that information in some other way and making money. So the profit is the motive here. So at this point, the attack or the intruders become more professional. So in the previous cases, they are not so intentional. They are accidentally they stumbled upon, or they had opportunity and they used it. Whereas here, they have an intention to make money. They have an intention to get the security compromised and get some data out of the system. And the fourth category is the largest of this all. This is in terms of commercial or military espionage level attacks or intruders. So these are large entities who have more money, more resources, and are able to use various techniques and exploit various vulnerabilities in systems to attack and access the data. So that is the fourth category. So we can see security threats and threats in the form of intruders can vary from simple non-technical users who are accidentally stumbling upon this information to governments or corporations who are targetedly attacking an organization or an individual's data and trying to access something there. So it can vary across the spectrum anywhere. So now, if we think about operating system security particularly, again we can think about what are some of the ways this operating system security can be compromised. So one of the basic ways it happens is, again, non-technical ways. So not very sophisticated, non-technical ways. For example, if you use a simple password that is guessable by another colleague or someone else, they may do that. Say if you use your date of birth or something that is easy to guess by someone else, they may do that. So here it is not a sophisticated attack, but they are using certain techniques to still access the system, access the information. One of the common things that happens in a lot of organizational environments is people write down passwords and still somebody who needs to access that information can access that if they stumble upon that written down password. So again, it becomes fairly easy, still not a sophisticated attack. One of the other things that can happen is, again, using certain human behaviors. So still not going into technical realm, still exploiting human behaviors. For example, one of the things that you may come across is systems that may ask you to reset passwords frequently. So sometimes it could be an LMS or certain other system that may ask you to reset password every 3 months or 6 months. The problem with this approach is it is meant to make that users are changing passwords and keeping up with good password habits. But the problem is, if the frequency of changing password is too much, they may resort to writing their password somewhere, and then it can again be exploited. Similarly, social engineering can be used in the case of, say, you may have a secure password, but your security question to reset the password may be something that can be gained from some information. So somebody may get this information by going through your online social media presence, or even offline they interact in a social setting and get some information about you. For example, if you may have used your birthday, which can be very easily guessed or fairly easily learned. You may have used a name of your mother or something, again, which can be again learned from a social setting, and then they may use that information to launch an attack or reset the password and get access to the system. So these are non-sophisticated social engineering type attacks. We need to be mindful of those as well. But at the same time, at an operating system level, we should also account to more sophisticated attacks from a more technical nature. So these are attacks that are more specifically targeting certain security vulnerabilities, security features of operating systems, and how the operating system can defend against those attacks. So those are also things that we need to be careful of. So there are these non-sophisticated social engineering related attacks that needs to be addressed and that are a concern, but also the operating system should consider these more technical oriented sophisticated attacks that are targeting the security framework of the operating system itself. So both of these things have to be considered when we are considering operating system security. So then, in terms of attacks that can happen in an operating system environment, again we can classify them into two broader categories. One is passive attacks and the other one is active attacks. So in passive attacks, what happens is these are attacks that happen in an operating system environment, but the users are not much aware of the happening of that. Say for example, these are underlying malware that is running in the system that is stealing information secretly, passively. So that is stealing your passwords and credit card details and so on from the system. It is doing that, but it is not trying to do any harm to the operating system the way that it operates. So it is mainly about stealing information from the network, from the operating system environment. It is mainly about that. It runs in the background. For example, it doesn't reveal itself to the user, the presence of itself to the user, and the attack happens in the background. Whereas in terms of active attacks, these are things that make the computer misbehave. So these will impact the operating system behaving properly, and they can make the operating system misbehave. Say for example, they may deny you access to the system, they may lock you out of the system, they may encrypt the hard drives. For example, like a ransomware may encrypt your hard drive. So these are more active attacks. The user will be aware that the attack is happening, and they will have to do something about that. So in terms of passive attacks, you may not know that that is happening, but still it is doing some harm in the background. Whereas in terms of active attacks, they may actively harm you from, say for example, erase your data, deny you access to the data, and so on. So these are again two different ways attacks can manifest in an operating system environment. Then in terms of solutions to these security threats, solutions to these security problems, there can be a number of approaches that can be taken. As I said, you may cover a lot of these things in much more detail in a later security course where it would be explored in much more detail. But just to understand, there are a number of different approaches these operating systems can take to address these. One of those things is, for example, security in the form of cryptography. So we conceal certain information using certain mathematical models, and we cryptographically encrypt our data so others cannot steal the data. We cryptographically lock the systems using passwords and so on. So again, some of these security mechanisms can be based on that. Then there are certain other security mechanisms such as software hardening and so on. So these are also various approaches that operating systems and relevant security mechanisms can take. As I said, you will cover these topics in much more detail in a later security course. But in this context, you need to understand there are a number of different approaches operating systems can take to fulfill this requirement. So now we can ask an important question here. That is, can we build a secure system? So that is it possible to build a secure system as we want? So it is 100% secure. Is that ever possible? The problem is the systems that we use today are much complicated. So if it is a simple piece of code, we may be able to verify that everything is okay, there are no issues with that piece of code and no security vulnerabilities are there. But the operating systems that we use and the various other software systems that we use along with these operating systems means they are significantly complicated. And when we have more and more complicated systems working together and interacting together, we are not able to ensure that every part of those software is secure. So with more and more complicated systems, we may never be able to ensure that every part of the system is secure. So we cannot say 100% this system is secure. So that is not something we are able to do. But at the same time, we cannot be like, okay, we can be secure, so we are just ignoring all the security requirements. That is also not possible. We have to consider security as an important thing because we may have a particular requirement in terms of security. So we cannot say we are going to use an unsecure system. That is also not acceptable. We may expect certain level of security in the systems that we use. So what we can try to do is, we may not try to achieve 100% security, but we can try to make our systems, make our software and so on cater to our security requirement, and that is what we can achieve. At least that is what we can strive to have in our systems. So that basic level security requirement is what we identify as trusted computing base. So what we have here is, we are saying we are not getting 100% security here. We are not saying this is secure in any form, but what we are saying is, in this trusted system, we have a base level security requirement. We have a basic level of security that we expect, that we call the trusted computing base, and all those requirements should be satisfied by the system. So we define a set of requirements and we say, if those requirements are met, then we can say that's a trusted system. We are not saying every possibility is met. We are saying these particular conditions are met, then that is a secure system. That is a trusted system. So that is the main difference here. We are not saying 100% secure, all the possible security vulnerabilities are addressed. We cannot do that because of these multiple complex systems. But what we can achieve is, we can have a set of requirements that we want to achieve, that we identify as the trusted computing base. And if all those requirements are met, we can say that particular system is secure, that particular system can be trusted. So the next thing that we have to think about when it comes to security is about how we can control access to resources. So if we think about our main security goals previously, confidentiality, integrity and availability, this is all about allowed people or certain people accessing the data and certain other people not accessing the data, certain people modifying the data or not modifying the data, certain people always having access to the data and others not being able to deny that. So all of these things rely on the ability of operating systems, ability of computing systems to control who has access to resources and who is not allowed access to those resources. So these resources can be computer files, computer hardware, printer, anything that we can identify as a resource or an object in an operating system environment that can be controlled in terms of who gets access to that or not. And there are a number of models that we can use to do this, such as protection domains, access control lists, and capabilities. We will look at each of these briefly to understand a bit more. But the main thing to remember here is all of these are about which users or which group of users are able to access these resources. So it's about we have these resources, we have these set of users, and we are going to create a mapping between who gets to access these. So that is what we achieve by access control. So the first mechanism that we have for access control is what we call as protection domains. And in protection domains, what we have is, say, we have a pair of object and right. Say, for example, we can identify a few different domains, domain 1, 2, and 3. In domain 1, any user who belongs to domain 1 they can read file 1, they can read and write file 2. Anyone in domain 2 can read and write file 1 and they can write printer. Same thing with domain 3, they can write printer and they can write plotter 2 and they can read, write and execute file 6. So that is the protection domain. What we have here is a pair of information, that is what object and what write. So that is what file, whether they can read or write or execute and so on. So each of these pairs can belong into any of these domains and users can be associated with these domains. So these are fairly similar to the concept of user groups or group IDs and so on in Linux, Unix type file system. So this is one way of establishing access control, that is using protection domain. So this is a pair of object and rights. Another mechanism that we have is what is called access control lists. And here what we have is, we have this property of what access and is associated with each of the objects. In the previous case, in protection domains, the access privileges are associated with, or the rights are associated with the users or user groups, and said what they can do with each of the files or objects. Whereas here, it is for each of the files, it would specify what each of the users can do. Say user A can or read and write, B can read, C can read and execute. So here it will be about the object. The object will have the access control list for its action. So, and it will list all the possibilities for different users or user groups. And capabilities are, we can in some ways see them as somewhere in between protection domains and access control lists. But what we have here is, we have objects, we have say users or owners or processes, and for each object we will have a particular list of capabilities, that is, what each of these processes can do for each of these files. So they can read or read, write, or execute. So that is another way of specifying what they can and cannot do in terms of access. So in these three approaches, protection domains, access control list, and capability list, in all these three, what we try to do is, we have these objects, we have these users or processes, and we want to map what they can do, what are the rights they have, whether they can read, whether they can write, whether they can execute. So we are trying to create a mapping between these users and objects in terms of these rights. So we create these relationships in few different ways, in protection domains, access control lists, and capability lists. Now let's look at something a bit more technical, a bit more theoretical in terms of security, in terms of access control models. So here what we have is, we'll look at two models about how we can implement certain requirements. So we have a couple of requirements. One is confidentiality and the other one is integrity. And these two things are somewhat competing with each other, and we will look at how these two models try to address those requirements, and you can see how these two things are sort of against one another. Again, these are some of the things that you will study in a lot more detail in a later course into computer security, but here we are just giving an introduction into these two models. So in terms of security models, we can categorize them into two, one as discretionary access control models and mandatory access control models. Whereas in discretionary access control models, operating systems will allow individual users to determine who may have particular type of access to their objects, their files, and so on. Whereas in terms of mandatory access control, the organization will specify what are the particular access control rules, what are the particular type of access rules apply to particular type of objects. So users cannot modify that. For example, in the case of a university environment, let's take a university environment, there are certain systems that should only be given access to the teachers, and there are certain systems that can be accessed by students. So in a discretionary access model, a user who is at the level of who can access these objects, documents at the level of a teacher, will be able to modify that access and allow other users to access the documents that belong to them. Whereas in a mandatory access control environment, if they belong to teacher group, they will have access to certain systems, but they will not be able to give access to their objects to other users who don't belong to the other groups. So particularly this would be used in, for example, in military type of any sort of high security environments. Mandatory access may be necessary because users should not have the ability to change who can and cannot access to the data. So that is the main difference between mandatory and discretionary access control models. And operating systems will have to implement their access control policies based on these requirements, based on the organizational requirements and so on, to cater to one or the other of these needs. Then when it comes to confidentiality of data, and integrity of data, we have two other data models that we'll briefly touch upon today. So the first one is called the Bell-LaPadula model, which is a data confidentiality model. So the basic concept is, if I have top secret clearance, I can access any document, anything at the top clearance level. And I can also read anything below. So if I have top clearance, I can read at the same level or read below. Whereas if I have low clearance level, I should not be able to read anything above my clearance level. So if we have different confidentiality levels, top secret, medium secret, and so on. So a person at the bottom level should not be able to read anything above their clearance level, and anyone at the top can read anything below their level. So they can read down. At the same time, if I am reading some information, if I am able to read something at a particular level, I should not be able to modify, or I should not be able to reveal that information to a lower level. So for example, if I have top clearance level and I read some information, then using that information I create a new document. So the new document I created is at the top clearance level because I belong to top clearance level. So there I should save that document at the same level or any level above that. I should not be able to save that to a level below, so the person at the lower clearance level can read it. So because people at the lower level should not be able to read above, we should not be writing to a lower level. So we should write at the same level or above, and we can read at the same level or below. So that is about confidentiality. So we are protecting confidentiality. We are making sure people only who are allowed to read something can read. So to do that, we have to keep that hierarchy of people can read below and they can write at the same or above level, so that information doesn't go anywhere below. So the writing above is about the information doesn't get written at a lower level, so that people at the lower level can read. For example, if I create some documents at a teacher's level in a university, I should not be able to write that to a student level so students can read it, because this document belongs to a teacher's level. But I can write it to an administrator level so administrators can read it. But I should not be writing it to a lower level of confidentiality. So that is the Bell-LaPadula model of confidentiality. The another model that we have is about integrity, which we call the BIBA model, which is in a way the opposite of confidentiality model, where say integrity is about people should not be modifying things that they should not modify. So when we think about writing something, we should not be able to write above. We should only be writing below. So if I have a particular clearance level, I should write in my level, or I should write below. I should not be going above and writing. So that is integrity. So if I have access to up to this level, I can change anything below that, but I should not be changing anything above that. On the inverse, about reading, the integrity is, if my integrity level, my trust level is this, I should only trust things above my level. I should not be trusting any information that is below my level, because my integrity level is this. I can trust at this level, so I should not be reading anything below. I can write anything below, but I should not read anything below. So this is the inverse. So I can read above and write below. So the integrity model and the confidentiality model are opposite to one another. So these are two formal models of security again, just to give an understanding of why confidentiality, integrity, even though those are two requirements that we have, they have these competing interests between one another, and we may cover some of these things in a bit more detail, as I said, in the security course. So the next thing that we can focus in terms of operating system security in general, is about authentication. So what we have discussed so far is about deciding who gets access to what. So we say these users can read, these users can write. We had these have various sort of access control models of various ways to build access control lists, capability lists, and so on. We had certain formal models, discretionary access, mandatory access. All these things were about who gets to access what object and what is the nature of the access, whether they can read and write and so on. But that who part, who is the person who gets to access, that is something the system needs to know. So for example, everybody cannot come and say I am the administrator, everybody cannot come and say I am user X. The system should be able to identify this particular person is actually that particular person. So the way computer system is going to learn about a particular user is that particular user as they claim to, is what we call as authentication. That is authenticating that they are who they claim to be. Say if I log into the system and say I am Nimal, then the system should be able to figure out whether I am actually Nimal or somebody else is trying to say that they are Nimal. So it's just because I come and say to the system that I am Nimal, it should not have to believe it. It has to depend on certain things to make that call. So in terms of authenticating users, computer systems will follow three main principles. So three main principles that they may follow to identify, to authenticate users as who they claim to be. So the three things they will depend on is something the user knows. So these are the way a PIN number or a password. So I will say I am Nimal and this is my password. So this is something that I know, and the assumption is only I will know about that. So that is something that I know and only I know about that. So that's why password should not be shared. Then the other one is something the user has. So these are things like smart cards or certain other devices that users can carry around, and they can use that to again authenticate. Because if I have this ID card, smart card ID card, then that means that should be Nimal. If I carry my ID card, then that should be Nimal. So I should not be giving my card to someone else. So the assumption is I will always carry my card, and if a person comes with my card, that should be me. Then the third category is what is called something the user is. So these are biometrics. So for example, things like fingerprint or iris scan, and these things, again, these are what the user is. If the user comes and present their fingerprint, then we assume only the user will carry their fingerprint. Unless somebody has taken their finger and using it, it should be them. So iris scans or face scans and all these things will fall into this category. So these are the three main ways that computing systems can authenticate users. The computing systems can determine that the users are who they claim to be using what the user knows, what the user has, and what the user is. So when we consider authentication, one of the simple ways of authentication is authenticating using passwords. So that is one of the simpler ways that we can authenticate. So we use a password, we give a username and a password, and we authenticate. But that is one of the most weakest ways of authenticating, because if somebody can guess the password, if the password is leaked, then anybody who can know the password will be able to access the system. So we can have number of variations to this about various challenge response type authentications. So these can be a number of questions the people have to answer. So all these things again fall into the same category of what the user knows. But the most suitable or the most secure way of authenticating could be not depending only one of these approaches of what the user knows, user is, or user has, but using a combination of those. So asking for a password and then asking them to swipe their smart card, or asking for a password and asking them for the fingerprint. So if we use a combination of those things, if we build a system that asks for a number of these things in conjunction with one another, then we may have a much more better authentication implementation rather than depending on only one mechanism. So that is one of the things to remember is we have three ways of authenticating. Only using one of those may not be secure enough in most situations, so we may use a combination of those, either two or sometimes even three of those things can be used. Then the next thing that we need to consider in terms of security and operating system environment is the software that runs on those operating system environments. So even if we can ensure all the access control is there, all the authentication is done properly, if we have some software that has some vulnerability, if that software has some issues in terms of security that can be exploited, then it is still a problem. So there are a number of ways these software exploits can happen, and as I said, that is not the focus of this course, but things like buffer overflow attacks or dangling pointer attacks, you may have covered some of these in few other courses, and we may cover some more of these in the later security courses as well. But just be mindful that the software, the application software that is going to run on the system, run on the operating system, is also a significant part that can be exploited in terms of security, and that can create vulnerabilities in the overall computing environment. So that is something that we need to be mindful of. When it comes to security, one of the other things that we need to be careful is about insider attacks. So these are attacks that are launched by insiders to an organization. So employees, maybe present employees, maybe recently past employees, and how they use their knowledge of the internal organization, the systems, to launch certain attacks, and we need to be aware of the possibilities in that type of situation as well. So for example, one of the common insider attacks is what is called a logic bomb, and this is where, for example, you are a programmer in an organization, and you in the software system that is developed by the organization, you have a piece of code that expects a particular password that you input into the system on a daily basis. So every day you go in the morning and input a password to make sure that you are still part of the organization. So then, if for some reason you are fired from the organization or you left the organization with some problems, you are no longer going to input that password, and the system will malfunction. Either system will erase itself, erase the data, or maybe send the data to a remote server and so on. So the attack is already built into the system, but that is controlled by a certain logic. It could be the logic could be based on something like this: a user inputting a password. The logic could be based on time, so after 5 years this should happen. So these are what we call as logic bombs. So these are pre-programmed malicious actions that are part of the system, and they only become active when certain conditions are met. Then the second criteria of an insider attack is what we call as backdoors. So the program will have a certain way of logging into the system, accessing information, and so on. But as the person who created the program, you may use certain code as part of the program. You may have an additional few lines of program that says if the username is input as this thing, you don't care about password and let them view the admin page itself. So regardless of what is the classification of user or nothing, no checking is done. They are just given access to the admin page. So because if it is just part of the program, it is written like that in the program. So it is a backdoor. So any admin, any person who has the knowledge of the system will be able to access using that backdoor, skipping all the access control and authentication and everything, and they can just directly go and access the system. So that is what we call as backdoors. And login spoofing is where we create a login page that is similar to the login page of a particular system, and then we present it to certain users, and then using that to collect some information, logins, usernames and passwords, and in turn we using them to access the system on the side. So these are some of the ways insider attacks can be launched. And the reason why this is very important is insider attacks are by far the most difficult to detect, because these would come into the system from the inside of the organization, and none of the sort of typical security mechanisms that are blocking anything coming from the outside of the organization is not going to stop this from happening. So this is why it could be a problem. So we have to be mindful of how these insider attacks can happen, and we have to do software reviews, code reviews, and so on to make sure that these things don't happen. Then another category of software vulnerability that can be encountered in operating system environments is malware. So either existing software, vulnerabilities in existing software can be exploited to do something. Say if a browser has a vulnerability and an external party uses that vulnerability to access the system, that is one thing. But whereas malware are software that is particularly created with the intention of a malicious intent. So they are created as spying or stealing information and so on. So the main intention of the software itself is to spread itself using email or through downloads or whatever the various means, and they come into the system, and then they try to either steal information from the background, so such as keyloggers that take passwords, credit card details, and so on, or things like ransomware that encrypt the hard drive and then ask for money for decryption and so on. So these are again malicious software that can come into the operating system environment and can cause damage in terms of the security of the overall system. Then we may have spyware. The main difference here is spyware would most likely hide itself, so the victims will not be aware of that. It will collect information about the users, so things like passwords and websites, passwords, credit card numbers, and so on. That information may be transferred to a remote server, for example, whoever will be using that information. So if it is credit card information, it will be transferred to a remote server from where that information may be used to transfer money, make fake purchases, and so on. And that is the main difference between spyware and malware. In malware, it is there, and it is the nature of how it spreads, and spyware is about that it runs in the background, not revealing itself to the user or the end user of the system, and it will be running in the background and doing harm still. Then another category of security risk that we may encounter in operating system environments is viruses, and this is a very basic thing that everyone will be aware of. There are a number of different types of viruses. Again, we are not going into details of each of these different types of viruses, but we may cover some of these in a later course. So now if we look at what are some of the defenses that we have against these various challenges, various security threats, one of the main things that we have to remember is just one security mechanism will not be able to protect us from all the various types of security threats. So we cannot have a single solution that is going to solve all these problems. So we will have to have multiple layers of security. So even if one of the layers are compromised, one of the layers fails, other layers of security is still there to protect us from whatever the attack that we are facing. So that's why we may use things like firewalls to protect us from the external networks, antiviruses to protect us from known viruses or similar viruses that are already known, code signing to protect us from software being modified, unnecessarily unknown modifications into software, jailing to protect, limiting access to what can access. So these are sandboxing methods where we will let certain applications run only in a limited environment within a limited resource scope. Various intrusion detection methods to identifying are there any external accesses, external intrusions into the system happening, and if we can detect those things. So we will take a number of these approaches and we will implement a number of these things in a layered manner. So even if one of those layers are failing, the other security layers may protect us. So in terms of operating system security, we will not rely on one of these things. We'll do these things. We will have a proper access control system. We'll have thought through authentication mechanisms, and having all of these things together will ensure a more secure computing environment. We cannot give a 100% secure environment as we previously identified, but we can improve the security of our computing environments by using various methods like these. So firewalls are basically trying to protect us from anything that is coming from an outside of a network. So if we have our systems and we will anything that is coming from an external network will have to go through the firewall, and it can be detected to see whether it is a bad or a good access, and then it can be denied or allowed. So that is mainly a mechanism in terms of networked computing infrastructure, and that is what most of our current computing infrastructure would be. So firewalls play a significant role in most operating system environments that we would encounter. Antiviruses are again so we would identify certain patterns of viruses. We would learn about these existing viruses, new viruses. We would identify certain patterns, and then we would try to use those, learn about those patterns, and then try to catch those in any sort of new information that we receive. Say, for example, an antivirus company, the company that develops antivirus databases, they would intentionally infect their files to get a signature, get a pattern of a particular virus in terms of how it attaches to the system and so on. And then they may use that information, put that into a database, and when it comes to another computer, that information in the database can be used to compare that with any new files that are received in the system to see if it contains a virus or not. Then another concept that we will briefly touch upon today in the context of security is cryptography. So the basic idea of cryptography is we are going to use certain mathematical functions to transform a piece of information into something that is not readily readable. And then, so we take a plain text, we put it through certain mathematical functions and convert it into something that is not readily readable. Then we may have to have the same mechanism that we converted to convert it back to read it again. So what we would have is, we would have our plain text and an encryption algorithm with an encryption key. So then we can convert it into a ciphertext. So this ciphertext will be something that we cannot read and understand. So if we take a plain text and convert it into a ciphertext, that is something not readable. So by reading it, you are not going to glean any useful information there. But then when we need to read it again, we will have to use a decryption algorithm with a decryption key, and we can get the plain text back. So we would have a two-part process here, an encryption process and a decryption process. In encryption, we take plain text and convert into a jumbled ciphertext that is no longer useful if somebody gets access to that encrypted message. But then again, when we need to read it again, we'll have to use the decryption key to decrypt and understand the message. So that is the basics of cryptography. We will use certain mathematical functions to do this thing. So this is very commonly used in file systems. So we may want to encrypt files and store in file systems. We may use them in networking. So if we want to have a encrypted network communication, we may want to use that. When we are storing passwords in systems, passwords in operating systems or various other systems, again, we don't want to store passwords in plain text, so we may have to store them in some scrambled ciphertext. So cryptography is used in many of these applications. When it comes to cryptography, there are two main types of cryptography that we would use. One is called secret key cryptography, and the other one is called public key cryptography. Again, we are not going into more details about these various cryptography mechanisms, but the main thing to understand here is, in terms of secret key cryptography, there is a particular decryption key, and you should keep the decryption key secret, and it should be shared with the receiving party. Say if you are sending some information to someone else and you use a secret key cryptography, you would use an encryption key and you would encrypt it, and then you would send that encrypted text to them, and you should also send them a decryption key using some other method. Either you have already met them and exchanged that, or in some ways that should be transferred to them, and that is what we call as secret key cryptography. So one of the simplest example of secret key cryptography is what is called monoalphabetic substitution. So this is where you take a plain text and you have a ciphertext that is generated using replacing alphabets in a particular order, and then you have a decryption key to revert it back to the original message. So that decryption key, if the decryption key is known, anyone can decrypt it back. So that is secret key cryptography. But the main challenge is both the sender and the receiver must have the secret key there. The alternative to secret key cryptography is what we call as public key cryptography. Again, we will be discussing public key cryptography in a much more detail in a security course. But in this context, what you need to understand is you'll have two pairs of keys, a public key and a private key for each user. So we have two users at two ends. We'll have a private key for one user, a public key for them, private key for them, and a private key for each of the users, private and public key for each of the users. Then what we would use is, we would use one of those, the public key for the encryption part, and it will be available to everyone. So that is public. So if I have a public key, I will publish my public key for every one of you. So you can get my public key and you will encrypt the message using the public key. Then when you send the encrypted text, I will use my private key to decrypt it. So the public key will be the locking key and private key will be the unlocking key. So I can have my private key with myself and give you my public key to lock the message, encrypt the message, and I can decrypt it at my end. And the same thing can happen at the other end. So this is a fairly commonly used approach in most security implementation, most cryptography implementations in present day. A good example is the signal messaging protocol that is implemented in many messaging applications. I highly suggest that you refer to the additional videos that are linked here to get a bit more understanding of this public key cryptography and how it is used in various messaging applications. And we can cover this in much more detail in the security course later. So the way that public key cryptography would work is, we will take the public key and that will be shared by everyone. So I can have my public key, your public key, another person's public key. So I will have a list of public keys that I will hold. And if I want to send a message, I will select a public key and encrypt the message and send it. And whoever is the recipient will use their own private key to decrypt the message. Because only the recipient will have their private key, only they can decrypt it. But the public key is readily available with everyone, so they can encrypt it. So in the case of, say, an instant messaging application, so everybody will have everyone's public key, so they can encrypt and send the messages across. But then the receiver will only have the private key, so only they can decrypt it. So that is the main idea behind public key cryptography. It makes it much more easier in terms of making sure whereas in secret key we have to share that secret key. Here that is not necessary. We can share the public key, and public key is only useful for encryption, not used for decryption. So it will still make sure that our information stays secure. Another cryptographic concept that is again using certain mathematical functions relevant to this is what is called digital signatures. So these are digital signatures, things like SHA-1 keys, MD5 keys, and so on, where we take a document, put it through certain mathematical functions, and produce a hash key. So the hash key will be a much smaller text key, and anytime we put this document again and again, it will always produce the same hash at the end. And if something changes in the document, then this will no longer be the same. So you may encounter this a lot if you're downloading software online. For example, if you're downloading, say, an Ubuntu ISO from the website, they may list a SHA-1 key. So you can download the ISO and compare the SHA-1 key that they have published with the SHA-1 key that you generate using the downloaded file. So if you download from a wrong server, or if somebody is giving a malicious file, you may be able to identify that something has changed in the file. So this is mainly about the integrity of the file. So we can check the integrity if something has inadvertently changed in the file by checking the digital hash there, so the digital signature there. So this is again significantly used in various software implementation. A number of operating systems, like even in Windows, you may see these signatures popping up saying this is created by a particular vendor, the publisher information will be verified, and so on. So this is what we mean by a digital signature. So again, relying on certain mathematical functions. And the last security concept that we are going to touch on today is what is called steganography. And in steganography, what we are trying to do is, we are not storing information in sort of encrypted mechanism, encryption and that type of mechanism. What we are doing is we are storing them in plain sight, so to speak. So we may store some text file inside an image file. So when they view the file normally in an image viewer, it will be displayed as an image file. Everything will be normal like that. But when they try to view it in a certain particular viewer, they may be able to access that hidden text information. So you can store some secret information inside some other information and then transmit. So anyone who is detecting the transmission will see as an image file. Even if they download that and see it in an image viewer, they will still see the image file. But when they can view it in a particular viewer in a way to extract that information, then they may be able to identify that hidden information that is stored there. So this is what we call as steganography. So this is mainly about covertly sending some information between two parts. So if we are expecting some people to intercept the message in between and see that, so if we are, so this is say for example, if we are expecting certain people to monitor our network usage and monitor every file that is transmitted, we may use this type of an approach to send some secret messages across. So that's all we have to cover in the security lecture in this operating systems course. And a number of these concepts we will explore in much more detail in later security courses. But I hope this would have given you an introduction into various security concepts and how some of these could be implemented in various operating system components. Things like authentication and access control and so on are things that you would be familiar with many operating system environments. So as always, if there are any questions, you can always reach me through usual communication mediums, email, LMS, and so on. And other than that, see you at the next lecture. Thanks for joining in this one. Thank you. Bye.